Hello and welcome back to the Armchair Reference Radio Half Hour. I'm Rachel Dankert, the Learning and Engagement Librarian at the Folger. Today I'm joined by my colleagues, Abby Weinberg, the Research and Reference Librarian, Morgan Ellison, Researcher Registration Assistant, and our special guest, the O.B. Hardison Poetry Series Artistic Curator and Poetry Programs Manager, Terry Cross Davis. A quick note before we get started. If you have questions throughout the program, please feel free to write them in the chat at the bottom of your screen. Thank you. At the end of our last program, our listeners enthusiastically voted in favor of today's episode theme, Poems and Tomes. In today's episode, we'll investigate researching poetic content and its containers. One of the most interesting parts of working with primary source materials is that both the subject and the object separately and in dialogue reveal important evidence about the circumstances of the object's creation and use. Today's resources will encourage us to consider how content and containers influence each other while also providing important tools for working with these components individually. In today's Folger Focus, let's dig into the Folger hosted resource, the Union First Line Index of English Verse, which we usually call the First Lines Database. While this resource may look humble, it's a powerful tool for researching manuscript and printed poetry across many repositories. You can narrow by library or the poet's gender if desired and search by keyword or first line to retrieve results. I'm going to start with a basic word like lemon without any filters to see what comes up in my search. In the results, you can see that the first lines and poem titles both include the word. Each first line record gives the poem title as well as the shelf mark to ease research across institutions or in early English books online. What's interesting in this search is that the poems themselves have content that represents the search term, but that their physical manifestation, in this case, invisible lemon juice ink, factors into a poem's creation too. This becomes even more complicated when we see that certain of these poems, like Abraham Cowley's Written in the Juice of Lemon, is printed in an edition of his poetry, making visible a poem that was meant to be only read in secret circumstances. To take us into the world of researching material culture of the book, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Abby Weinberg, the Folger's Research and Reference Librarian. Hi, Abby. I'm excited to see what you have in store for us today.
Thanks, Rachel. It's great to be back, and we've got some great resources for our listeners today. One of the challenges when studying early modern texts as objects is finding out which libraries actually have a copy. This is where union catalogs come in handy. A union catalog is, as the name implies, a catalog of items drawn from many different institutions. For English printed books, ESTC, the English short title catalog, will show you which libraries have which items. And the USTC, the Universal Short Title Catalog, does the same for early modern texts printed in Europe. Remember, though, that both of these catalogs are opt-in. That is, a library has to choose to submit their holdings. So there are certainly collections out there that are not represented in these catalogs, but they're still a great place to start. Now, if you're looking for something a bit more specialized, there are sites for that too. For example, the Shakespeare Census Project is bringing together all known copies of Shakespeare's texts from the earliest quartos through 1700. Like the more general union catalogs, this site will tell you where those copies can be found, and they've even got links to digital surrogates where applicable. If you're more interested in the people than the texts, the British Book Trade Index has you covered. This site aims to include brief biographical and trade details for all of those who worked in the English and Welsh book trade up to 1851. And if you're interested in the book trade in Scotland, don't worry, the National Library of Scotland maintains a similar database too. One of the things that is most interesting, but most challenging about looking at texts as objects is the paper itself. And a good look at paper wouldn't be complete without attempting to decipher the watermark. The squiggly lines may seem like a Rorschach's ink blot test, but they're actually really well documented designs. There are a number of different watermark resources out there in both print and electronic, and today I'd like to highlight one in particular, the Thomas Gravel Watermark Archive. This database lets you browse watermarks by a predetermined set of descriptors and gives information about the item upon which the watermark was found. So if you're trying to figure out whether that squiggly animal is a unicorn or a stag, give this database a try. Finally, I'd like to highlight a specialized bibliography site, the Women in Book History Bibliography. This site brings together scholarly texts about women's writing and work in the book trade. It's a great place to start if you're working on a new project that touches on one of these subjects. So as you can see, there's a huge range of sites out there that can help if you're researching material, culture, and book history. As always, if you have questions about these resources, feel free to drop us a question in the chat here or email us at reference@folger.edu.
Today's episode is brought to you by Folgerpedia, the wiki for all things Folger. Research lists, annotated bibliographies, past exhibitions, content, and more. Folgerpedia has research gems hiding in plain sight. Try a keyword search today at folgerpedia.folger.edu.
As we shift our focus back to content, let's dive into a few resources that can help us navigate verse in a variety of forms. First up, let's look at a relatively new companion to the first line index we examined earlier, Manuscript Verse Miscellanies 1700 to 1820. You can navigate by first lines under the Poems section, or browse other sophisticated gatherings of information, including by coterie, role of the poem, or individual people. You can also dig in by manuscript with lots of great options for narrowing your browse. While this resource covers a later time period than we usually discuss here on Armchair Reference, it's clear that poetry defies periodization and MVM is worth a visit. Early Stuart libels takes us into the world of satirical poems, lampooning politicians and political events during the Stuart period. Like other poetry databases, you can also navigate this one with the first lines feature. However, since the poems were intentionally written to obscure their true subject matter, other navigational tools are useful here. The content section gives a useful overview of various scandals to assist with reading the poems, along with an index of first lines for each scandal. Navigation by name also proves helpful as it indexes all names, including those implicated but not explicitly named in the poems. Some poems were made to be sung, and we can see the printed versions of these works in two different databases, English Broadside Ballad Archive and Broadside Ballads Online. The English Broadside Ballad Archive specializes in 17th century printed broadsides, around 4,000 ballads, and allows for many entry points, including modern keyword, Samuel Pepys classification, tune, illustration, and full text search. The records included some exciting bells and whistles, like recordings of the ballad, frequency analysis for the images, and a word cloud based on word frequency. Broadside Ballads Online from the Bodleian Library has a much larger repository of ballads and covers a longer time span, almost 30,000 ballads spanning the 16th through the 20th centuries. One of the most powerful parts of this database is its browse navigation. I'm partial to the subjects and the themes browses. Helpfully, Broadside Ballads Online has integrated English Broadside Ballads Archive, making it a good first stop in your search. For our next segment, What's New with You, I'm delighted to introduce the O.B. Hardison Poetry Series Artistic Curator and Poetry Programs Manager and Poet, Terry Cross Davis. In keeping with this episode's theme of poems and tomes, we asked Terry to read a poem for us by Lucille Clifton and a work of her own. Thank you for being with us today, Terry, and for sharing these works for us.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. First, I just like to jump in and read this poem by Lucille Clifton, who is my favorite poet of all time and a former Maryland Poet Laureate. She has such incredible work that stirs the soul. This is a poem called Study the Masters, and it's a poem that I recently wrote an essay on for Poetry Daily. The reason why this poem stands out to me is just because it's about domestic workers, and I often don't run into poems about domestic workers. And having had family members who were domestic workers, I love that there was a poem that lifted them up and elevated them and their work. Study the Masters, Lucille Clifton. Like my Aunt Timmy, it was her iron or one like hers that smoothed the sheets the master poet slept on. Home or hotel, what matters is he lay himself down on her handiwork and dreamed. She dreamed too. Words, some Cherokee, some Maasai, and some huge and particular as hope. If you had heard her chanting as she ironed, you would understand form and line and discipline and order and America. So again, an incredible poem that highlights domestic workers. And I like to think that poetry is a form that elevates its subject matter. So I also love to hold on to the idea that this is a poem that's elevating its subject matter and the people involved in it. So from that poem that talks about domestic work to a poem that I wrote that also talks about domestic work. My second book, A More Perfect Union, came out last year, this month. And one of the things that I did in this book is I created my own goddesses. I'm a big fan of mythology and comic books, so it was a natural. So there are 9 different goddesses, 9 for a reason, but there are 9 different goddesses in this book, including a goddess of the South, a goddess of blood, a goddess of anger. Here is the goddess of cleaning. I bequeath you bleach, its singeing sting. I bequeath you the scrub brush, best done on hands and knees. I bequeath you ammonia for the exorcism of dirt. I bequeath you power over clutter, the washing machine spin, the dryer's lint grin. I bequeath you the salvation of sweeping, a consecrated grip on the broomstick. I bequeath you the dustpan's collection plate, the floor's sanctified echo, the trash bin's penitent face. I bequeath you the gospel of a mop, the sacred slosh of a rinse bucket's second coming. I bequeath you the torn t-shirt as rag, the two-sided sponge, vinegar and newspaper squeak, the glass free of streak. I bequeath you an old toothbrush for tiles hard to reach grind. I bequeath you the grunt and scrub of wool, the eradication of rust. Trust in me, I baptize you in sweat, labor's beatific stain. I bequeath you the power to change, one room at a time.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Terry. So I'm seeing an affinity between the 2 poems that you shared with us today, and a lot of poetry kind of hidden in plain sight in the Folger collection, which is poems written by people about their service workers in their homes. So there's a lot of, or in school, so a lot of Cambridge scholars write odes on the people who work in the kitchen, for example, or the people who are doing the cleaning of their rooms. And so it seems like a really amazing connection between the 2 worlds about 400 years apart.
Yes, and I think it's important to get not just mention of people into literature, but to get their voices in literature too. Yes. So I love this as an evolution.
Definitely. And this dialogue with history is something that is upcoming in the next month's Folger poetry reading. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Oh, yes. I'm really excited to feature the poets of Alice James' books. We'll have 2 poets, Shara McCullum and Tamiko Byer, who have put out new works. Tamiko Byer's book is called Last Days, and Shara McCullum's book is called No Ruined Stone. And it's and to talk about McCullum's book, she takes the life of the Scottish poet Robert Burns and imagines a whole different timeline for him. So I like to think of it as a little bit of Afrofuturism, but with a bit of a backwards glance. So I love that innovation. And with Last Days by Tamiko Beyer, what she does is she brings in the voices of the ancestors. She looks at the moment in history. She looks back at previous moments, and she strings together a collection of thoughts and ideas that kind of propel us toward the future. So I love that both of these incredible poets chose books that had or were in conversation with the past with an eye on the future, hence the title of the reading being Writing the Past to Write the Future. I think it'd be a hopeful evening. It'd be a truthful evening. It'd be an honest evening, and it will all be virtual. So people can watch in their pajamas, as I like to say.
Sounds great. I put the link to the event in the chat for everyone to see, and we encourage you all to sign up for this online program that's happening Monday, March 7th at 7:30 p.m. Thank you again, Terry, for joining us. We really appreciate it and feel so honored by the readings that you did today.
Thank you so much for having me, Rachel. It was just a joy.
Our pleasure. Talk to you later.
Okay.
To close out our show celebrating poems and tomes, we'd like to take a few eye candy items off the shelf where the books stand upright, the prints rest in mylar, and all the manuscripts lay tucked in their folders. In these examples from the Folger collection, content and their containers work together in fun and unexpected ways. We first see this interplay in a jeweled binding on a small press edition of Shakespeare's sonnets, completed by former Folger head of conservation Frank Mowry in honor of the Folger's 60th anniversary. The 56 diamonds and 4 rubies highlight the most prominent feature of the binding, its 2 segments of 14 gilded lines, drawing our attention to the sonnet form rather than content. A poem can also serve as its own container too, like in the printed and manuscript versions of 2 of George Herbert's well-known poems, Easter Wings and The Altar. Both present verse in forms that enhance its meaning. Easter Wings presented an interesting print challenge by changing the orientation of the verse and the length of each slide. The Altar required the copyist in this poetical miscellany to have seen the poem in its printed form so that they could retain the shape of the altar in its reproduction. It seems fitting that this poem coexists on the page with the sonnet, bringing our observations of content and container full circle.
That's all for today's broadcast. Before you go, you get to choose our next show. Please take this quick poll to vote on which episode you want to see next time on the Armchair Reference Radio Half Hour. Which session will win? Option 1 is Save the Drama for your Early Modern Mama, Early Modern Non-Shakespearean Drama Resources. Option 2 is Theater Folk, Performance History Resources from the 18th century to the present. Or option 3 is Crack the Code, a digital humanities project special episode. After you leave this session, a survey will open asking you to share your thoughts on today's session by answering 3 quick questions. Share your feedback. Be sure to watch for the announcement of our next broadcast, and thanks for tuning in.